they had to know all those basic things to answer those quiz questions. And those every day, every class day, they would have one of those due, and they made up 10 to 15% of the overall grade by the end of the semester. So there was some, little bit of a push to do that. The key thing with this is designing those quizzes so that it forces them to actually do some reading still. And so I would put in fill in the blanks, which were, you really had to look up those terms to be able to fill that in. I love the multi-select, right? Pick all of them that apply to this situation. Well, guess what? You're going to have read about each of those. And so it's really about coming up with a way that you're forcing them to, at a minimum, they had to read about these things to answer these few questions. And then there were occasional days where there were certain activities that I had done previously, or labs, where really the first hour was kind of plug and chug, setting things up. It wasn't really anything I needed to help them with. It was the second part that was difficult. And so there were certain days where I said, okay, you need to come with this thing set up in a spreadsheet or whatever, and then we're going to do the hard part in class. And so I would oftentimes have them enter, made up a quiz again and have them enter some of their values, and they could keep doing it until they had the right values so that they know they had the base set up. So during class, when I taught it traditionally, I did a traditional 3 hours of lecture a week, typically Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then I had labs, typically Tuesday, Thursday, for an hour and a half each. And so during lecture, as I said, it was taking notes, they're following those concept questions. Occasionally I might work a quantitative problem kind of as a class together, but for the most part it was very much lecture. Then the lab class periods, I would typically have a lab each class period, so about an hour and a half long. Sometimes there might have overlap between 2 days, but it was very separate from the lecture, and sometimes it lined up, sometimes it didn't with the every other day. So with the flipped format, I started every day with a warm-up exercise. And the idea behind this was to get students kind of geared up. You can think about this in terms of, at the beginning of the lecture, I made you all discuss and figure out what a flipped classroom was. It was a pretty basic thing, right? You were just sort of doing a simple discussion, not having to apply too much, but it forced you to maybe recall something you'd read about ahead of time or had heard about before. And so I typically would take about 15, 20 minutes, and I should point out the 6 hours a week, I broke those up into 2 3-hour blocks. So they only meet 2 days a week now, but we have these big chunks of time that we can do all of these different activities and really develop the concepts. And so after that warm-up exercise, I would have some conceptual activities. So an example, when we talk about water budgets, which is how much water is going in and out of a lake or in and out of the groundwater, first, we would just talk about our bank accounts, right? Because it's the same thing. If I put more money in my bank, then it's going to grow. If I take more out. And so we could relate that to, okay, well, what outputs do you have? Well, I got to pay student loans. My car broke down. I got to pay for that. I work a job, so money comes in. And so all of these conceptual types of things didn't involve any math. It was just thinking about problem solving without any numbers, because that tends to scare them a little bit at times. Then that would be followed up by some sort of application activity, which was typically more quantitative. So, okay, we've learned about the concepts, we've applied those, now we're going to add the math to it. And then I would end every day with an anonymous learning survey, which was a way for me to figure out what they had gotten out of class, what they were still confused about. It's also a way for the students to kind of rethink and reset, what did I learn today? And it forces them to recall some of that information again. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail. So then after class, when I taught traditionally, I would give them these problem sets. Okay, well, you got about 15 questions. There were maybe 5 each semester. And so the idea was, right, they were supposed to be working on these over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. And every class I'd say, okay, well, you should be able to do, these first 2 problems now. Go home and do them. How many you think went, actually, no. They waited till 2 nights before this thing was due and tried to do all 15 at once. So what I do instead now is they have 1 or 2 problems. They're actually due immediately the following day. I only give them about 24 hours to do the assignment, with the idea being then I can immediately grade that and have it back to them by the next class so that if there are any issues, we can cover those before delving on into new material. And this allows for really further application. So these were things that we did in class, but maybe just an extra little twist or an extra little thought that they had to do outside. The other big change was the course project. So it used to just say, okay, pick a partner. You can pick any topic you want in hydrogeology, or pick your favorite area of the country and talk about the geology there. And then they would give these presentations to the class. What I did with the flipped course is I put them in consulting firms, right? So environmental consulting firms where they had to actually figure out, okay, we know this pipe leaked. Where did the contamination go? What are the impacts? How are we going to clean it up? And then they also had to turn in a consulting style report at the end. When I do their presentations, we go over, I do it in our university center, so it's a different setting. I invite the campus, I invite alumni, and the alumni are great because a lot of them work in the field, and so they'll ask them some tricky questions to really get them thinking about what am I doing in the future. And so it's also great way to get your alumni involved. So think about, are there things that you could do that could tie your course together and really get those skill sets? All right. So before I move on, are there any questions about sort of the overview of what my course looked like? Okay. So let's talk about how I did it, because I know that's the piece that you guys really want to know. The big thing is you have to figure out what are those big key course learning objectives, right? By the end of the class, what are those things that my students absolutely have to know? I mean, I know as a professor, right, we all want them to know everything we know by the end of the semester. That realistically is never going to happen. So start with what are the things they absolutely have to know. And then from there, I broke that down into sort of chapter objectives initially, right? Okay, so I need them to be able to understand how water levels in the ground change. Okay, well, they get that out of this chapter, and I can and then from there, I could break it down into daily pieces. So a lot of this was based on those terminology and concept questions I had already made, right? I had made those when I did the traditional lecture. You all have probably lectures that you could do the same thing with, right? Go through those lectures and think about, okay, what are the things that I absolutely have to have them know out of these lectures? And which of those things can I put online, and which of those things can I do in the classroom? That's really the key, is what do they absolutely need to know? And then at the end of the day, I found I really had a lot of unnecessary material. Yeah, it's really cool and I love to talk about it, but it really wasn't the key things that they needed for this class. And that's the other thing, is don't be afraid to remove some of those unnecessary things. When you really sit down and think about, okay, what are the big goals I have to get out of this class? Well, maybe that little minute detail that I love to talk about really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. So with the online preparatory materials, I really had to go through and think about which of these things for my terminology and concept quests are really basic concepts that the students should be able to either get out of the textbook or simple videos, right? And if you do online videos, 4 minutes max. Like, don't make them sit there and watch some crazy long lecture. You want to put them into these little short sound bites. And so at most, I maybe had 4 videos for a particular class period. So maybe they had 15, 16 minutes total, but they weren't all at once. They could watch one, answer that question, watch another one, answer that question. The other thing then in class is, okay, so I made sure they knew all these basic concepts coming in. How am I going to apply those in the classroom? So for example, right, okay, well, they can look up what a water budget is. How am I going to apply that in the classroom? That's where I got the idea of, well, it's like a bank account, right? So think about, are there real world instances, things that they may already be familiar with that relate to what you're talking about? And so that's a great way to start the application, and then you can take it one step further of getting that more complicated piece. So the biggest thing is things that are not easily learned from a short lecture, right? If it's something so complicated you can't translate in a little mini lecture, it needs to be an activity in class. It's something that you need to work through with the students. So another thing is utilize what you have, right? Don't feel like you have to completely start from scratch and redo the whole thing. So I had those terminology concept questions. I have lectures, right? I made those lectures for 2 semesters. I had lots of labs, and I had those big homework assignments that were gigantic. And so it's about thinking, how can I take these things, break them into smaller snippets, and use them in a way that the students can really glean the knowledge that I need them to. So what I'd like you guys to do now is just talk again with your partner. Start making a list. What are some things that you already have that could either be put online, they're basic things the students could learn, or things that you have that could be expanded and used in class. So take a few minutes, talk with your neighbors, and I'll walk around and see what you guys are coming up with.
Instead of going over primary documents, like I have all these primary documents that we usually do and then like
Yeah, well, what do you do when they haven't watched it? And they come to class completely unprepared and you're facing black. What do you do?
Yeah, and that's a great question. You're exactly right, because that is a big concern, right? If they don't do because if they haven't done the work, it's really hard to, and so one is just continual reminder, like, oh, we have the drive the car discussion multiple times throughout the semester. The other